People often think of existentialism as sort of like a depressing, gloomy, um, dark view of humanity, or the view that nothing matters in life. And sometimes, as we've seen, existentialism can be pretty depressing. Actually, I've just been reading Camus' The Plague, which is about a town in Algeria that's stricken with plague, and very, very applicable to our times. And it's not a light read. It's pretty grim, but Sartre in Existentialism Is a Humanism tries to show that there's more to existentialism than that. It's actually very empowering and optimistic and humanistic above all things. Now, a couple of the things to keep in mind about this approach is that he's not speaking for all existentialists. He's talking about his own particular variety of existentialism, and some of the things he says here he disagrees with later. So this is from 1946. It started off as a lecture, and then it was developed into a written piece. And again, he's not speaking for all existentialists here, but some of the things he says I think are fairly generally relevant. First of all, the defining characteristic of existentialism, as we've said, is the view that existence precedes essence. So one way to think about that is, any human artifact, if we make something, if we make a knife, or if we make a mousetrap or whatever like that, its essence is determined by what purpose it was made for, what function it's supposed to have. Now, if we had been created by God, we might be similar, that we might be created with a specific purpose. Now, Sartre is one of the atheistic existentialists. So he says, we don't have that. We don't have the type of function built into us that we might have had as a creation. So we come into existence without any specific purpose. And what that means is we have to create our own purpose, right? He says man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have any sort of natural traits or anything like that, but that each of us has to determine over the course of our own lives who we're going to be. And for Sartre, that's more optimistic than many views of human nature, like the idea that that human nature is corrupt, or there's just one way we're going to be, that we can never change, etc. So no, we all have within ourselves the power to make our own lives and to decide what kind of person we're going to be. All right, so that's one aspect of existentialism that Sartre thinks is overlooked. Okay, now the image of existentialists that we sometimes have is of someone who's very solitary, and I mean that's really understandable when we hear, not just Sartre but Kierkegaard and to some extent Heidegger. But particularly Nietzsche, they talk about the individual and being apart from the herd, etc. But what Sartre tries to bring in is that, even though we are each responsible for our own actions and we see the world from our own distinctive perspective, that we still have a responsibility to the rest of humanity, right? Because one point that Sartre particularly makes is that in making a choice, we're making a statement of value. We're saying that we're kind of endorsing that choice for humanity. So with the freedom that we have, with the freedom that Sartre believes we have, comes an enormous responsibility. Do we want to say this is a good way to live, right? Now, when you do something that maybe is considered wrong, the thing you might think is, well, what if everybody did that? So if you litter, I say, oh, it's just a small piece of trash or whatever like that. But what if everyone did that? Then the whole world would be filled with garbage. Now, when you look at, for those of you who are familiar with Kant, when he talks about the categorical imperative, he says, well, you need to consider what's the maxim behind your action and whether that could be universalized. Could it be a policy that everyone follows? Now, what Sartre is saying is pretty similar to Kant, that we need to consider, is this universalizable, the choice that we're making in this particular case. And but the crucial difference for Sartre is that, unlike Kant, he denies that there's any sort of objective principle or universal objective principle of morality that we can turn to determine what's the right thing to do. And that, I mean, that is an intense responsibility. It's what he refers to as anguish. You know, there's anguish in making those kind of choices. With Kierkegaard, he focused on the example of Abraham sacrificing his son, you know, and so, of course, a person in that situation would always have doubts, you know, do I know that this is the voice of God? Do I know that I'm making the right choice in this situation? And there is no way to know with certainty, right? Anytime you make a choice, you have to make your best guess, and there is genuine anguish in that. Now, anguish, of course, does not sound like a great thing, but Sartre wants to emphasize that it's not a kind of blasé, nothing matters. It's because our choices matter so much that we have that sense of anguish. Okay. Now, you know, you'll always see people say, like, a sports figure or, you know, a musician or whatever like that, who says, I don't want to be a role model. You know, I can do what I want. I'm not trying to get other people to emulate me. But for Sartre, you know, he says, you can say you don't want to be a role model, but whatever we do, we're expressing certain values and we're affecting other people by our choices. You know, we're just not alone, and we can't act as though we're just making choices in a vacuum. All right. And the real difficulty from Sartre's perspective comes from the fact that he, you know, he is an atheist. He does think that, you know, we don't have God to turn to provide us with guidance, to provide us with some kind of reassurance. So, as he puts it, we're condemned to be free. We don't have a choice, because there's nothing else to fall back on. Okay. Now, when we try to make our choices, we can turn to moral philosophy. We can read Kant, we can read Bentham, we can read John Stuart Mill, and we can read contemporary moral philosophers. We can read the Bible. But, you know, we have to ultimately make our decision on what to do in any given situation. Now, some people might say, well, you just have to go with your emotions, or that you're guided by passion and you have no choice but to sort of follow your heart. Or sometimes, you know, like some people might talk about love justifying their actions. They're just swept away, right? Because, you know, passions aren't an excuse. Your true feelings, you know, are not necessarily going to guide you one way or another. You know, whatever, you can look at your feelings, you can look at your values, but ultimately the only thing that really matters is what you do, right? Because you could say, well, I did this, but that's not really, you know, it doesn't really support my values or whatever, or that's not my true feelings. It's like, well, you know, all we have to go on really is what you did. You know, clearly if you made that choice, you felt strongly enough to make that choice and not a different one. While you may have had certain sentiments in another direction, if those sentiments were strong enough, you would have made a different choice, right? So we're ultimately in the position of taking full responsibility for our choices and not being able to point to some external guide or even some kind of internal force that makes us make one kind of choice rather than another. Now, there's a well-known example that Sartre brings up here, where he talks about a student of his who is deeply conflicted about what to do. His mother is you know, older and dependent upon him, and you know, he's really the only one that she has to count on. But he also wants to fight in the Free French forces, and you know, he doesn't know if he'll make a difference at all. You know, if he joins the Free French forces, he might not even be able to fight. You know, he might be killed before he even is able to be put to any use at all. He might be doing something that is sort of pointless. So, you know, on the one hand, there's this political goal that he values very highly, but where, the contribution that he makes is extremely uncertain. And then there's this other personal goal to help and support his mother. Now, that's a bit more certain, that he knows that if he stays, he will, likelihood be able to, bring her a lot of help and comfort. And if he leaves, he knows that's going to be quite difficult for her. But, it's not absolutely certain in that case either. So, he goes to Sartre and asks, what should I do? And really, there's no right answer to that question. You can't make some kind of calculation in terms of how much utility will be provided by one action rather than another, or some calculation of the probability of a positive occurrence or something like that. Or you can't look at the Kantian categorical imperative or anything. Nothing's going to tell you what you should do in that situation. So for the student, ultimately he has to decide for himself, right? There's no way, there's no moral system that will output the right answer. And what is the right answer for one person in that kind of situation might be completely different than what is for another. So for Sartre, he says, that's the challenge of having this freedom, is to make a genuine choice and to live with it, and to live with the uncertainty of how that choice is going to come out. Now, another aspect of existentialism that Sartre talks about is despair, another upbeat subject. So one aspect of despair, existentialism is not like the power of positive thinking at all. It's not this view that, you make your vision board and that's going to happen or whatever like that. Existentialism is full of awareness of the fact that there's a lot of things that are not under our control. We can control our own actions, right? But we can't control what other people are going to do. We can't necessarily determine what situation we're going to be in. We can't ensure that a particular outcome is going to be achieved. We can try with all our might, but it might not happen. So, what Sartre says is, in a sense, we have to act without hope, and that doesn't mean act with pessimism or fatalism, say like we can do our own part and that's it, right? We can take care of what's up to us, and everything else, is kind of like up to the universe to determine what's going to happen. It's up to the other people involved. It's up to the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and all sorts of other factors outside of our control. So, the only dignity really that we have as human beings is taking care of our part. And I think you can see from what we've talked about so far that for Sartre, existentialism is not sort of a passive philosophical view. It's not about kind of just moping around in your bedroom and, black turtleneck and smoking clove cigarettes and whatever, talking about despair or whatever like that, it demands action of us. Right? So it's not a philosophy of quietism. So quietism being sort of like there's no point doing anything because nothing matters. So somebody who takes a passive approach might just like make excuses for what they choose not to do. Say, well, I would have been a great writer if only I'd had the time or the opportunity, or this obligation or that obligation hadn't happened. Circumstances have been against me. Like, no, that doesn't wash. For Sartre, he says it's up to you to take action or to take ownership of your own inaction. You can't just blame it on your circumstances. Okay? There's really, really nothing beyond the choices that you make in life and what you do that define who you are and what kind of life you're going to lead. Okay? So there's where, we can talk about anguish, we can talk about abandonment, we can talk about despair, but there is a certain element of optimism to it, in the sense that we are responsible for who we are. I mean, that's an important thing, and it gives us a greater sense of agency than many other views about human nature. So we have the power to determine who we are. We're not just cogs in a machine. We're not just imprisoned by our biological nature or anything like that. We we have the capacity to turn ourselves into what we want to be. There's this idea that some people are sort of natural leaders or natural heroes, and some people are just born a coward, and Sartre says that's not true. Nobody is born a coward. Nobody is born a hero. If you become a hero, that's because of the choices that you made, right? And anybody has the capacity to do that if they so chose. Okay, so existentialism is a humanistic view, because it's saying that what choices we make as human beings matters. Okay, it recognizes the dignity of human beings. Doesn't just treat us as an object, like Ortega said, just like a stone. We're not like a stone. We're a self-creating being. Okay, and also it doesn't treat us as completely isolated and solitary. Right? We exist in a world of intersubjectivity. Now, here I want to look at a specific quote of Sartre's here. It says, "The other is indispensable to my existence and equally so to any knowledge I can have of myself." Now, if you read more into Sartre, he talks a great deal about the other, in his play No Exit, he says, hell is other people, and he talks about the gaze of the other and how kind of we see ourselves, we understand ourselves through being perceived by somebody outside of ourselves. So say, if we were completely solitary from the get-go, we wouldn't really have any kind of understanding of ourselves, because we have nothing to respond to or to relate to. We have nothing to reflect back to us what we are. Okay, at least that's what I think Sartre means by that. If you have some other ideas about what he means about the other being indispensable to our existence, that's something that would be really interesting to hear about, and I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts on that. Okay. Now, another humanistic aspect to existentialism, according to Sartre, is the fact that, like I said, we don't have a human nature. We don't have some sort of built-in determinant of what we're going to be like. But he says there is such a thing as the human condition. That is to say, there are circumstances that all of us as human beings find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a circumstance where, there's things that we don't have control over. There's many things that are unknown to us, and we have to sort of make our choices without a map. Or you might say, there's plenty of maps. Of course there's plenty of maps, but the very abundance of maps is what makes it so hard to decide what's the right thing to do, because we have to decide among them, which one to follow, right? And that's ultimately up to us. So that's the human condition. I once had this thought, this image of sort of like a heath, like a grassy hillside, and there's no path, no road, no fence, no rail, no nothing, and this is what our life is like. We have to walk along this heath, and we don't have any markers to guide us. We have to decide for ourselves what way to go, and that's kind of terrifying, but it's also very freeing. We're not just ants following a trail. We have to set our own path. Okay. Now, because we do have this shared condition, this shared circumstance that all of us find ourselves in, it's possible to relate to people even in quite different circumstances. We might think of people who lived in different historical time periods or different parts of the world as being dramatically different from us, and in many ways they are. But we're all essentially in the same boat. We all face this human condition together, so we can, to some extent, relate to each other regardless of how different our circumstances might be. Okay. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit later in the semester about existentialism and morality. So some views of moral philosophy associated with existentialism. Now, Sartre doesn't particularly put forward any kind of existentialist morality, but he does talk about authenticity, as we saw in the discussion on self-deception. Now, for Sartre, he says, really, that's the only standard. Going back to that student, who's trying to decide to stay with his mother or to join the Free French. I have a hard time saying that. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Free French Forces. So there's no morally right choice to make, according to Sartre, from some objective moral standpoint, but he can make a choice authentically. Like, if he doesn't want to join the Free French Forces because he's afraid, if he's scared for his life, but then he tells himself, oh, I should stay with my mother because she really needs me, then he would be in self-deception. He wouldn't be making that decision authentically. But if he decides to stay with his mother because, he cares deeply for her and he's very concerned about what will happen to her if he leaves, then he's making the same choice, but he's doing so from a place of authenticity. So someone who denies their own freedom, who denies that they have a choice in the matter, is a coward in Sartre's mind. It's like they're being cowardly and denying their own freedom. And he says, scum are people who claim that their existence is necessary rather than contingent. Now, he just kind of throws this in there. These people are scum. Now, he isn't specific about who he has in mind, so I think that's an interesting question. Who does Sartre have in mind? And I was trying to think about that. I mean, the coward thing is pretty clear from what we were talking about in relation to self-deception. But I think by scum, and maybe I'm just, projecting my own preferences or beliefs onto this, but I think he has in mind somebody who's very, narcissistic or entitled. They think that something is owed to them, that they feel like, I'm not just a person among people. I'm special. I'm different. I deserve, special exceptions to be made for me. So I think that's the kind of person that he's talking about. So like, this person, they're just, the average everyday Joe on the street, but I'm special. So what happens to me matters. That's my interpretation. Again, if you have a different take on that about what Sartre might have in mind, I'd be really interested to hear it. Okay, so for Sartre, it says, our values are self-chosen. There's no one else to dictate them for us. One can choose anything, but only if it is upon the plane of free commitment. Okay, so from a moral standpoint, one choice is not better than another, except insofar as it is authentic to the person making that choice. Now, you might fully disagree with that, and a lot of existentialists do. They think there's a big difference. And I think, too, for Sartre, he had commitments, particularly political commitments, the French resistance during the Nazi occupation of France, that was something that was really important to him. And he was a defender of socialism through much of his life. And those political commitments, he had beliefs about what is just and what is unjust. And those were things that he was willing to stand up for and to deal with a lot of criticism for. So it's not to say that he doesn't have commitments. He's just saying his commitments are his own, right? And other people have to make commitments authentically to who they are. Okay. Now, when Sartre says existentialism is a humanism, there's a certain way of talking about humanism that he wants to distinguish from. So there's the kind of humanism that sort of marvels at how awesome humanity is. So, the contributions of particular individual human beings might be terrific, and say, oh, that's a work of genius or whatever like that. So you can say, oh, humanity, we're the pinnacle of creation because we're able to achieve these great things. And for one thing, I think that bothers Sartre because it's sort of like taking credit for somebody else's achievement. You could spend your whole life sitting on the sofa and say, hey, look, humanity is so awesome because, it's created all this technology, etc. But you didn't do it. You don't get any credit for it if you didn't actually contribute to that. So he's not saying that humanity is great because of the actions of particular human beings. He's saying, human beings have a dignity and an importance in terms of the way that they live their lives. We're not the pinnacle of creation, but we are self-creating beings, and as such, we're able to be continually self-surpassing and self-transcendent. And that's the sense in which existentialism is a humanism. I'm going to finish up with, this is the last video lecture I'm going to give on Sartre, but I'll have some posted on Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil that we're going to be talking about next. If you have any questions about Sartre, about the reading, or about the class in general, please get in contact with me. You can get in contact with me by email, or if you'd like to text or call, that's also an option as well. All right, thanks.